Hey everyone, we're back here on the Whirling Circles podcast. This is Sean Garcia. We're here for episode 2 with Frank Allen. Hopefully, you got a chance to check out our first episode. Went out last week where we talked about Frank Allen, his background, and also his school, the Wu Tang Physical Culture Association. It's a great episode, lots of stuff in there. But one of the main things we started talking about, and of course, what this podcast is dedicated to, is a discussion on the internal martial arts. So we wanted to do a 3-part series introducing you into these 3 core systems within the internal martial arts, and starting with Ba Gua Zhang. And there we go, the book, which the podcast, if you didn't know already, now you know. The podcast's name was created in relation to the book that Frank and his co-author Tina put together a few years back, and we'll definitely share how you can access that book online, on the website, on Amazon, all that kind of stuff. It's an awesome book, one of the I think, in my opinion, one of the greatest documentations of Bagua Zhang in the English language. And so we're going to talk about that stuff and pick Frank's brain about it. So Frank, good to have you back this week.
Good to
And
be back.
by week I mean 5 minutes later, because we're filming this in the same day, so people don't think we wear the same outfit every week. But for
You
those who are
told me I could
listening
have
to
changed.
yeah, exactly right. They're on the second set of clothes. So Frank, so before we get into discussion about Bagua Zhang specifically, last week you started kind of introducing people into the concept of internal martial arts. Can you talk a little bit more about what internal martial arts are and how they relate to other forms of martial arts, and maybe even specifically some other Chinese systems that might not fall under the internal martial arts category? How do you classify internal martial art?
It's difficult. It's difficult. If you're going to, most people figure 3 internal martial arts: Tai Chi Chuan, Bagua Zhang, Xing Yi Chuan, because they're noted for being completely internal. But really, the whole concept has been around a lot longer than that. We know these because they got famous in the 1800s, mostly the mid to late 1800s. So they were kind of last in the line. And at that point, these particular 3 got famous because Yang Luchan, the founder of Tai Chi, was teaching Tai Chi to the Imperial Guards of the Forbidden City. And Guo Yunshun, the Divine Crushing Fist, the most famous fighter in Xing Yi Chuan, was teaching in the house of one of the dukes in the Forbidden City. And Dong Hai Chuan, the founder of Ba Gua Zhang, was teaching in the emperor's nephew's house. So they were 3 of the most famous guys up at the top level of teaching the actually elite of China. So we know about them. The reality is that internal as a concept and as a teaching had been around for a long time. And in fact, most high level Chinese martial arts have internal aspects. What they used to do in a lot of them was teach internal to the youngsters. Excuse me, external. Teach external training to the youngsters and keep them doing external till they got mature, which mature was different ages at different times. Let's face it, it used to be at 40 you're about washed up, and now at 40 you're just getting started.
Right.
So maturity came at different times, but you would teach external until they started to hit the outer edges of mature, and then you would teach internal. So most of the high level martial arts were actually external internal. And only the lowest level village martial arts, where everybody involved was illiterate and perhaps no shining light in the intellectual universe to start with, were completely external.
Right.
So the whole concept of internal has been around for a long time and
And
appears in.
when we're saying internal and external, we're not saying hard versus soft. We talked about that. We're not talking about better fighting martial application than one than the other, right? Because I think that's
No,
sometimes when people think about internal martial arts, they're kind of thinking like softer, gentler, not really martial application.
no, as I said last time, there are different methods of developing power. External power development is athletic training, muscular contraction for strength, aerobics for stamina, repetitive hand-eye coordination drills to develop unconscious reflexive action for speed. Internal replaces that with mind intent, weight momentum, or pumping of the bodily fluids for strength, relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing for stamina. Whenever possible, speed is replaced with timing and positioning. What speed there is a byproduct of the relaxation, and it's all conscious movement, not unconscious movement. Different methods of developing power. And hard and soft are different methods of dealing with force or power thrust against you. Hard, my force meets your force head on and overcomes it. Soft, give before force come back where there is no force against you. And hard and soft, internal and external, can be mixed up in any manner. So that Tai Chi is primarily internal and soft. Xing Yi is almost exclusively internal and hard. And Bagua is famous for switching back and forth between hard and soft. But that's the internal arts. I mean, you can take a tiger claw or an eagle claw system, and when somebody punches, and that guy with his muscles latches onto that punch and pulls it in the direction that it's going, it's external muscular contraction strength, but it's soft force with force because he's pulling him the way he's going. So you can mix hard and soft, internal and external in any manner.
And you would say probably too, as a lot of people get more skilled in their system as they get older, trying to be more efficient with their energy output, sustaining their body, right? Not breaking down their body. That they start probably adopting some more internal practices or gravitating towards that, probably, huh?
Yes, yes. Like I said, you can internalize anything. And I mean, the very first private student that I ever had came to me to teach him how to internalize his batting for the Central Park Softball League. And we worked on it, and he became the batting champion that year. Not that I took a bum and turned him into the batting champion. I think he'd been second the year before and just trying to move from second to first. But he came to me to learn how to bat internally, and it worked for him. You can do anything.
Yeah, there's a cool article that came out in the New York Times a few years back. I know you're not a big fan of Wing Chun per se, but there was a bunch of football players who were getting trained in Wing Chun to learn how to deal with sensitivity and momentum and kind of being able to get around defenders who are pushing their force against them in a more effective manner, just with angles and body position and things like that. So yeah, like you're saying, it could apply to anything. But why these three arts now? Or I mean, outside of them just being famed because of their positioning in Chinese society and becoming famous on that end, why have they stood out as the three internal martial arts today?
Well, as I said, they were sort of the end of the line. It was after that, close quarters combat was always done in conjunction with firearms. And in fact, in other
Mm,
places in the world, it was done before that. I like to point out at the height of the internal martial arts in China, which would be the mid late 1800s, probably the ultimate martial artist in the United States would have been about the 12 or 15 guys that could draw and fire a single action Colt in less than a second.
right.
And there was only 12 or 15 of them. But it was that's the end. And it's also that's because we have kind of at least I'm about to get into the fact that legends and history mix drastically, but at least you have a little more hard history from the 1800s than you do stuff from the 1600s and further back.
Yeah. So maybe let's get into it. So let's go specifically to Ba Gua Zhang. We'll touch on the other two in the next episodes. But what's the history that we know? What's some of the mystical history that might be out there too? But what's the history that we know about Ba Gua Zhang?
Well, what I'd like to begin with is a quote that I start my legendary history chapter in the book with. which is legends are apt, however, to be as right in substance as they are wrong in detail.
Mm.
Legends are based on something, and the substance is liable to be as strong as the detail is off. Um, and that's particularly martial arts. It's history in general, but particularly martial arts. It's hard to draw a line where the history ends and the legends start, and legends end and the history starts. Particularly in China, martial artists were not the leading pillars of society. They weren't that level. And let's face it, when you read about history, you're mostly reading about kings and presidents,
Right.
not about servants who are good fighters. So a lot of it ends up being
Unless it
legend and
becomes a
history
Hollywood
blending.
production, a Hollywood production that turns them into something else. Some
Well,
movies out there
yeah,
turning. We'll talk about that
yes,
later.
yes, yeah, we've gotten into that some, but I mean, the founder of Bagua, Deng Hai Chuan, was a palace eunuch servant. He was a servant in the household of the Prince Su Wang, who was the emperor's nephew. And all they know for hard facts is that he was a servant who taught martial arts and collected taxes for the prince. And he did two martial arts. He did Lohan, and he had this stuff that was strictly his, this weird, constant movement, circling, coiling, strange looking martial art that he called Ba Gua Zhang, 8 trigram palm. And that it had some connection to the I Ching because it was called 8 trigram palm. But he didn't teach that connection to many people. Very few did he teach that. Mostly he taught it as a martial art, and at first he didn't even teach it. At first he just kept it for himself and taught the students Lohan,
Mm.
standard um, Northern Shaolin by classification. But there are, of course, numerous legends as to where he came from and how it happened. Uh, in fact, I have my favorite. My favorite is that he was a thief who was out robbing people on the edges outside of Beijing. And he wasn't the best thief in the world. So they started, he was good at stealing stuff, but he wasn't good at not getting caught. And so they started closing in on him. And the first thing he did was he ran away to a temple. Good dodge. But as the legend goes, he was quickly thrown out for intemperance. You can pick which intemperance you figure it may be, but he was thrown out for intemperance. So much for hiding in the temple. So he goes back to robbing again, and all of a sudden the troops are closing in on him again, and he runs to hide in the mountains. But he's a city guy. It'd be like any city guy now trying to go out and do the survival thing with no training. And he gets lost, he gets sick, he gets screwed up, and this Taoist who lives in the mountains finds him,
Mm.
brings him back to where he lives, his hut, his cave, whatever, and nurses him back to health and says, I'm going to teach you this stuff that will keep you healthy so this doesn't happen again. And teaches him this continuous walking, coiling, circling thing that develops loose, supple muscles, develops internal power, pumps your bodily fluids, massages your organs, and is also a physical, energetic manifestation of the study of the phenomenon of change as represented by the book, The I Ching. And he teaches him this. And then Deng Hai Chuan, being a thief by nature, goes back to stealing and using this as a better, more efficient method of stealing. But then again, they're closing in and it isn't going to work. And he has to do something. He has to do something drastic. So he becomes a eunuch, which is a great disguise because when you become a eunuch, your muscles go mostly flaccid, including your face muscles, which means you look different.
Mm.
You shave your head, you don't have hair, your face muscles are slack. You used to have a muscular body, all of a sudden you don't. You look different. And then in the hide clothes theory, he gets a job in the emperor's nephew's palace working in the kitchen. The guy that peels the vegetables and does the dishes and low level kitchen guy. And this whole eunuch thing was pretty bizarre also. They went into it in a certain bit in the Bagua journal. They actually had a picture of one of the eunuchs with his pants down. I don't ever want to see that again. But
Mm.
because the whole thing is Chinese eunuchs were not like Middle Eastern eunuchs. Middle Eastern eunuchs, they just took off the round parts.
Mm.
Chinese eunuchs took off everything.
Everything.
And then they stuck a lead plug in the urethra that you took in and out when you had to pee.
Mm.
And there was some guys out by one of the gates that their business was making eunuchs. And people would show up and pay them to have this done. And they'd strap them to a board, and they had some ritual where 15 to 20 times they'd ask you, "You sure you want to do this?" You weren't getting your money back, but they'd cut you down and let you loose anytime you went, "No, I changed my mind," right up to the end. And then they'd do it. And
Why?
these guys
Why?
must have,
Why would people pay for that?
I was going to get into that in a moment. But first, I wanted,
I gotta ask that question. I'm like, oh man.
to point out these guys must have been much stronger than us.
Mm.
Because most of us would have died of shock immediately.
Yeah.
And if you didn't, you'd die of sepsis. I mean, you got an open thing, you stick a lead plug in it and bandage you up and send you home. 65% of these guys survived. 65%. I figure today it'd be like 1 or 2% would survive. But why did this happen? Yes, why did this happen? It was particularly towards the end of the Qing dynasty. It was a depression like we couldn't imagine.
Right.
Beijing at the time was mostly 60% unemployed,
Mm.
40% homeless. Now, guys are dying off, so at a fairly young age, all of a sudden you're the head of your extended family. And everybody's after you. You're supposed to take care of us. You're supposed to take care of us until they're driving you nuts. Until you're ready to, go see the guys. Because here's the deal. If you survive, you absolutely get a servant job that makes you enough money to support your whole family, and they leave you alone. And if you don't survive, it's not your problem anymore. So that's why people were doing it.
Right, because it was the only way of gainful employment.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was guaranteed to get you enough money to support your entire extended family if you survived. So that's why they would do it.
Mm.
Except for Deng Haichuan, according to this legend, did it as a disguise because he had run out of other options of hiding from the authorities. So then he's working in the kitchen, and one day they have the emperor, the nephew has the emperor over for a banquet. And it's one of those places, they got the kitchen here, they got the courtyard walls and a big open courtyard, and the emperor and the nephew at a table on the other end of it. And the chef has made one of these meals that if it's served immediately after it's cooked, it's the best delicacies in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, the chef will, get all kinds of accolades. But if it sits for 20 minutes, it's garbage, and the chef gets his head cut off. So the chef finishes his meal, and the servants go out to serve it, and they're like, "We can't get through. It's too crowded. We can't reach the emperor's table." And the chef is freaking out because it's not just food's gonna spoil. They're gonna kill him for the food being spoiled. When the guy in the back says, "I can serve it." Now, normally they wouldn't let him touch this meal or go anywhere near the emperor, but it's got to do something. So they tell the guy, "Okay." And all of a sudden, the guy is taking trays. He's jumping up on the wall. He's running around the wall. He's spinning. He's going around the table. He's doing all this stuff. He's serving the food and putting on a show at the same time. He gets it out there. Everybody's really, really happy, and especially the chef. But so's the emperor and the nephew. But along the way, they realize that this has got to be some kind of martial art that he's doing. And as well as part of the banquet was to celebrate the new martial arts instructor for the household. who had just come, who was a Chinese Muslim guy.
Not the guy serving up the
And
dishes.
no, no, that
Not
guy was
that guy.
just a kitchen help. And so they had, somebody says, the nephew probably says, okay, we want to see this martial art.
Mm.
So they clear space in the middle, and the serving guy does this incredible continuous coiling, continuous twisting, continuous circling, continuous movements like they've never seen before, which is incredible. And of course, the new martial arts instructor sees his job going out the window, and he's like, so he immediately makes the horrible mistake of challenging the guy. And immediately, and this servant guy was pretty good size too. The eunuch was pretty good sized guy. And he immediately trashes the Muslim, just throws him all over the place. The Muslim doesn't stand a chance. And immediately, he's no longer a servant guy. He's a martial arts instructor
Mm.
and is going to be taught how to collect taxes also. So that night, the Muslim guy is not happy. And he and his wife sneak up to the new room that the eunuch has now. And they actually have, the wife has pistols from the West. And the husband sneaks in with a knife and he's headed for this eunuch. And the wife's outside the window with the pistols. And all of a sudden, from a blur of motion, the guy rolls out of bed, decks the husband, throws a knife across the room. The wife can't see what's going on. All of a sudden, she's grabbed by the wrist, dragged into the room, pistols yanked out of her hand, thrown on top of her husband. And not being complete dummies, they immediately start kowtowing and banging their head to the floor and apologizing, yada, yada. And he actually makes them his first top students.
Mm.
They, after that point, study with him. And he becomes the martial arts instructor slash uh, tax collector
Mm.
for the Prince Su Wong. But no one sees this wonderful martial art again. He starts teaching the students Lohan, which other people teach and has been around a while. And suddenly, he's teaching. Everybody knows he has this special martial art for himself, but he only teaches Lohan.
Mm.
But there are other versions of this also. That just happens to be the one that I like. But purely legendary history. Eunuch shows up. He's a martial arts instructor, tax collector. Nobody knows how he got that way. And then mixing history and legend, but a bit more plausible in history, was as he goes to work every day, he walks by this place where there's a lot of people selling stuff. And little guy who's selling sweet cakes. Eunuchs were noted for being sweet freaks,
Mm.
probably because they're also noted for smoking opium, and the two went together. But they're noted for being sweet freaks. And this guy knows that this eunuch is a great martial arts instructor, and every day when he goes by, he gives him a free cake until the guy notices him. And then the guy says, "Why don't you come by?" And he does, and he begs to become a student. And the eunuch's like, "Well, for X amount of money, you can become a student. I'm teaching the household, and you're not in the household." So he sells his sweet cake business and shows up and gives the eunuch the money. And they come back the next day and start training. And come back the next day, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I've just given this guy my whole life. And I've never seen him do anything. I've just heard he can do this stuff. I've never seen him do anything. And the part of this story that I particularly like is Dong Hai Chuan was rolling a cigarette, and all of a sudden Yin Fu attacks him while he's rolling a cigarette.
Mm.
And he turns and does an open palm thrust, hits Yin Fu in the mouth, knocks his two front teeth out, says, "Get out of here." Goes back to rolling the cigarette, didn't even drop a bit of tobacco while knocking the guy's teeth out. Just rolling the cigarette. But the Prince Su Wong is watching. And he
Mm.
goes, "Wait, wait, wait." Dong Hai Chuan, what, master? He says, well, this guy's really brave. He's really courageous. He just attacked you just to see what you could do. I mean, I admire that. So I don't want you to kick him out. I want you to train him. And doing, oh, okay, if you say so, you're the boss. And the little guy's name is Yin Fu,
Mm.
and he becomes Dong Hai Chuan's best student, the absolute best student that he has by far, because he trains harder. Just a matter of he works harder than everybody else. Becomes the best student. Also becomes famous for wearing this huge black mustache, which is to cover up the fact he has no front teeth. But yes, it's a good trick. But he and so at a certain point, and here I think it gets a bit more historical. The Prince Su Wang tells Deng Hai Chuan that he wants him to go to Mongolia and spend the next 3 or 4 years collecting his land taxes from the Mongolians.
Mm.
So he brings his number one student with him, and they go out there. And needless to say, the Mongolians aren't happy having these guys show up they never saw, telling them that this guy they never heard of owns their land and they want the taxes. But they are bet that they're extracting these taxes from the Mongolians. But it takes a little longer than expected.
Mm.
In fact, instead of 4 years, it takes 10.
Mm.
10 years they're out in Mongolia. Now, they aren't exactly hanging out with the Mongolians, who probably all hate their guts. And they don't have a whole hell of a lot in common. You've got a former small businessman married with kids and a eunuch, perhaps a eunuch ex-thief. We're not too sure of that, but and the eunuch. So the only thing they have in common is martial arts. So when they're not working to spend their time, Tung Hai Chuan trains Yin Fu. And after about 4 or 5 years, he's taught him all he can teach him in Lohan. He's
I was
getting
gonna say
bored teaching this guy.
5 years of personal instruction, you know, all throughout the
Well,
day.
he gets tired of teaching him
Um,
Lohan. So he teaches him Bagua. He never taught anybody else, but he teaches him Bagua. And Yin Fu, with his heavy work ethic, and absorbs it, gets it really well. And he has a Bagua that's somewhat Lohan based. It's a lot of it uses the ox tongue palm. There's a lot of piercing palm techniques, and it's sort of he's seeing it as a graduate course, which he's only ever planning to teach people that are already martially quite adept, and he'll change it a little bit to work with what their base is.
mm.
So Yin Fu learns this Lohan based Bagua and gets really good at it. When they finally get the money, they're headed back to Beijing. Deng Hai Chuan's like, I am teaching Bagua because it's hard to teach Bagua. People don't get it. It's really difficult. So I'll tell you what, you could probably make some money at it, though, because you don't have that much anyway. So why don't you open up a school in Eastern Beijing and teach Bagua, and I'm going back to teaching Lohan. So they get back to Beijing, and this is what's going on. But then Deng Hai Chuan decides he's upset with Yin Fu for a great social faux pas, which he thinks his students should never be this off the social scale. What happens is a Mandarin gentleman is never supposed to remarry. And while he's gone to Mongolia for 10 years, his wife has died.
Mm.
Now, you can hang out with as many courtesans and concubines as you want, but you're never supposed to remarry.
Mm.
And Yin Fu makes the horrible social faux pas of falling in love with one of his girlfriends and marrying her. And Deng Hai Chuan gets batshit over this and decides, well, he can't have my art to himself. So the first student that he picks up after that is this noted bully coal merchant, Ma Wei Chi, known as Coal Ma. And he starts teaching this guy Bagua. And this guy is a horrible person. He's just a horrible guy. But but he's hard trainer. I mean, he gets it. And I don't know what his previous martial art was, but all of a sudden he gets, which no one else did, the whole system, a bunch of fist techniques in the palm thing. And Ba Gua Zhang is called 8 trigram palm. He gets a bunch of fist techniques in it.
Why palm
And
versus fist? Before you go on with that history, why palm versus fist? You think?
um, there are tremendous strikes that you can do with your palm, with the palm, with the edge of the hands, with the fingers, with the other side of the hand. There's a lot you can do that's more adaptable. And actually, of all the different palm positions, the reason that Maui Chi got the fist techniques is the fist is actually considered the palm position. It's just the fist is considered the fully coiled palm. And in
Mm-hmm.
Bagua, it's called Chuanjiang. Everyone else calls it Chuen, fist. In Bagua, it's called Chuanjiang, fist palm. It's one of a
Mm.
multitude of variations. So it's there. It's just one of many.
Hmm. Okay.
And because there's so many different palm techniques, they called it 8 trigram palm. But the fist is considered a palm variation. And Maui Cheese noted for his shop. A lot of the shops and the whole front would open up like a garage door, and he'd open up his shop. And while he's waiting for customers to come, he'd shovel coal from the bins into a big pile in the middle of the shop, and then he'd start circling the pile and actually hitting the coal.
Mm.
And people would come by and watch. And if they watched and were quiet, or they watched and they said something about an interesting martial art, he was okay. But it's really weird looking stuff. And he really had a bug about anybody saying it didn't look like martial arts. And if anybody said that, and there's this one famous acrobat in his neighborhood that said that at one point, he'd say, "Come here." They'd walk in, he'd roll the door down, lock it, and then he would beat them up until he was convinced they knew it was a martial art. They may have been convinced quite a while ago, but until he was convinced they knew it was a martial art, and then he'd open up the door and throw them out. And
Well, it's like
that wasn't
when
the
my
word.
wife saw me training Bagua for the first time, and she said, "Oh, it looks like you guys were dancing." I was like, "Hey, we were not dancing."
Well, tell her the story of Maui Chi, and
There we go.
she's lucky you don't have a pile of coal.
Don't get me in trouble, Frank. All right.
And then, but he was also noted he'd get in these challenge matches.
Mm.
People would go to these specific place in Beijing to meet and have these challenge matches. And like they'd show up with these placards. They'd carry, pole with a sign. They'd usually say something like, my martial art is still as a mountain. My martial art flows like a river. He carried one that said, "I hit you once and you're dead." That's what his placard read. And the whole rule of these challenge matches were you could do whatever you want as long as you didn't kill somebody.
Mm.
If you killed them, it was murder and they'd cut your head off. But you could do anything else. But once they crossed their threshold, they got home, crossed the threshold, they were home. You were no longer responsible. And in that scene, he became known as 10-Day Ma because
Mm.
everybody he fought made it home. Nobody lived more than 10 days. So he was known as 10-Day Ma on the circuit. And eventually, this lifestyle does not make you real popular. And he never saw 30 because when he was 29, the family of somebody that he'd killed decided they'd had enough. And they hired an unscrupulous herbalist to poison him
Mm-hmm.
and exit Maui Chi. Uh, but um, he was a tremendous fighter. Liu Jingru has said, from everything that he's heard, Maui Chi was the best fighter that the Bagua system ever had. Better than, except for perhaps Deng Haichuan himself,
Right.
but better than Yin Fu, better than Chen Tinghua. And while this is going on, it's sort of estranged as not like we would think of it, because there's certain things that still they got along with, even though Deng Haichuan is upset about this social faux pas. So Yin Fu is training his cousin, Sure. And one day Sure comes to him and says, "Well, you got these senior students and they don't like I'm your cousin. Every time they see me in the street, they beat me up." And Yin goes, but according to the system, they're your senior brothers and they're allowed to do that. There's not really too much I can do about it because they were training with me longer than you. So that makes them your senior brothers, and they're allowed to do that. And I think there's well, there's one thing we could try. Is the master's mad at me, but he isn't. It's sort of I'm going to give you a letter of introduction, and if you could become a student of Dung Hai Chuan, then they could never touch you again. They'd be terrified to go anywhere near you after that. So he gives him a letter. He goes to Dung Hai Chuan. Dung Hai Chuan takes him in as his third student for Bagua. And the guy goes on to become known as Tricky Legs or Cunning Legs Sure, specializing in the fast kicking techniques, and that he's a
Mm.
smaller guy and gets really, really good. And Sure was one of these guys that wasn't just training his thing. He was one of the guys that was a martial arts freak that liked martial arts in general. He hung out with all the different martial artists. He went to see all the contests. He went to see all the shows. He went to see all the demonstrations. He was in the martial arts scene. And as such, he's friends with the current Shuaijiao wrestling champion of Beijing. And he starts telling the guy about this wonderful martial art that he's learning. That, very few people have learned it, but he bet if the wrestling champion wanted to learn it, the master would teach it to him. So eventually he brings the wrestling champion, who is Chen Tinghua, founder of our system, to Deng Hai Chuan. And Deng accepts him, starts training him a little bit more towards the grappling than it's not Yin Fu's piercing palm style. And in
Mm.
fact, they developed the dragon claw palm, which have variations, fingers open, fingers closed, but it's all set for the grab
Mm.
because he was a Shuaijiao champion. And being a champion already and being kind of a training nut already, he was also an eyeglass maker. Fairly well-to-do guy with a shop where he was sort of the equivalent of an ophthalmologist, but not so much. Here, let me make you some glasses, and sold eyeglasses, made a good living at it. But all of the eyeglass guys sat on these tall stools with their legs crossed, one leg down, the other leg across the knee. To train his legs for wrestling, he used to hold that position all day long, but no stool.
No, still, yeah.
Just yeah, no stool. And when he got into Bagua, he decided his legs had to be even stronger, so he did that, and he added a 10-pound weight vest for his
Making me
day's
feel
work.
lazy sitting in my chair right now doing this interview. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, we bang out a horse stance or something.
And he immediately became the new top student of all the students of Dung Hai Chuan and became the assistant instructor. And they worked stuff together. They developed forms together. They developed quite a relationship of that. So henceforth, the two top students forever are known as Chun Ting Hua and Chung style and Yin Fu and Yin style. Because, of course, there was no Ma style because he got poisoned. Um,
But there are a few different styles that are kind of recognized in practice now, right? How many? How many
well,
today
I
are?
don't, I don't know how many per se, but on Dung Hai Chuan's tomb, there is a list of 72 disciples.
Mm.
So yeah, he taught more than this. He taught 72 disciples. So he taught Bagua to 72 guys.
And it seems
And
like all of them had a different expression of it. Maybe some prior martial art or some anatomical
well,
variants.
because they'd get taught differently.
Mm.
Now we teach people what we learn. Chung style is Chung style, but in those days, everybody had a personal style. And that's why a lot of Bagua is where in Tai Chi you do it exactly the way it's done. And in Bagua, a lot of times you go, well, master, is it done this way or that way? He goes, either's okay. Because you get to, once you have the basics down, you're allowed to personalize it. There's
Mm.
even forms that specifically do it this way, do it that way, whichever you prefer. I like to point out, I have my music analogy for the three internal martial arts. Tai Chi is classical music.
Mm.
Every note in the exact place, year after year, it's classical. Bagua is jazz. After you learn the basics, then you get to be interpretive. But of course, you have to learn the basics. It's like people that don't understand that John Coltrane mastered every chord progression on his saxophone before he started playing discord.
Mm.
And people that try and play his discord without mastering the chords sound like crap.
Mm.
So you have to get all the basics down. But when you do, you are allowed to, in fact, supposed to interpret and personalize your bagua. It's jazz.
And Shingi.
And in the same musical thing, Shingi's heavy metal.
Nice. Well,
Shingi
there's a
is
lot of
absolute.
people in modern day MMA or the Jeet Kune Do scene that are hypercritical of classical martial arts, saying that there is very little expression and personalization. And it sounds like you're saying that is not the truth at all.
No, it's not. But I have an article I wrote. We were doing a newsletter a few years ago. Um, Marcos helped me. We did 2 years of newsletters before I decided no one was reading them. So that was the end of that.
We'll see how
But
our podcast goes.
yes, exactly. But one of the newsletters I did was about the fact that they are completely different, whether you're talking about classical martial arts, fight sports, close quarters combat system, self defense,
Mm.
and also as subdivisions, bodyguard is and security guard are also subdivisions also, and they are different things. They're completely different things. And classical martial arts is a study of a martial art that was probably a close quarters combat system in its time and place. But you are studying it as a historical art.
Mm.
You study the techniques, you study the time period it came from, you study the adjacent philosophy, health practices, meditation. You recognize that it's from a specific time and place, and that some techniques that worked then may not work now.
Mm.
It was from a specific time and place, but you were studying a historical art, a classical martial art. As opposed to if you're studying a fight sport, you're studying a way to win a sport
Mm.
that has always been adapted to try and limit serious injury and completely eliminate death. Which, because classical martial arts have certain techniques in them that are designed specifically for serious injury and death. But they also have techniques that may not even work anymore because they are from their time and place. But you have fight sports that are designed as sports. Then you have close quarters combat systems, which are military stuff, which is designed to take the opponent and make him non combat effective as quickly as possible. You want him broken or dead as quickly as possible. It's beyond fight sports.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, classical martial arts were close quarters combat systems of their time and place, but it's historical. It's generally not their time and place anymore. And the close quarters combat systems may be very effective, they may not. At the moment, the U.S. Marines close quarters combat system is very, very effective. The Krav Maga that the Israeli military and secret services and agents do is very effective. It's not the same as out there to the public, but it's very effective. You know, the Russians have a very, very effective close quarters combat system.
Mm.
But it's all about injuring this person until they're not combat effective or killing them, making them so they are not combat effective anymore as quickly as absolutely possible. Close quarters combat systems.
That's some
Then
great
you have
context for it all. Yeah. Yeah. Keep going.
then you have self defense, which I'm going to be doing a workshop on, as you know. Um, Self defense is making enough room to get away and getting away. At any point that you have the option to leave and you don't, it's not self defense
It's not self
anymore.
defense anymore. Yeah.
If you decide you're angry and you want to stay and fight and do the monkey dance thing and whatnot, it's fight. Period.
Mm-hmm.
It's not self defense. If you decide you have to stay and defend your daughter, your wife, or whatnot, it's totally righteous, but it's not self defense anymore. It's bodyguard. which is an advanced subject. If you decide you're going to protect your property that they're trying to steal, it may be absolutely righteous also. Maybe you really need this stuff, but it's no longer self defense, it's security guard.
Hmm.
Again, an advanced subject. Self defense is making enough room to leave and leaving. And that can be anything from seeing the situation and leaving before anything happens, from trying to talk your way out of it, all the way up to you have to kill them to get away. But whenever you have the option of leaving, you leave. Self defense is making enough space to leave and leaving. So as you look at it, classical martial arts training, close quarters combat training, fight sports training, and self defense are completely different studies.
Hmm.
Now, the whole thing is they tend to get mixed in that most of us that teach classical martial arts also have some development of a sporting style because people like to compete. So it's taking your classical martial art and adapting it to some type of whatever sport you've decided that you're going to have your people work in and adapting it into a fight sport of certain parts. But it's only for that particular sport that adapts to your particular classical martial art and it's separate from the study of the classical martial art itself. It's just an adaptation.
Hmm.
And most of us also teach self defense, in which we will take principles and ideologies from our classical martial art, but it's a different study. It's self defense. So the schools tend to overlap this stuff.
Hmm.
And some do better at one thing and some do better at another. But in general, the study of classical martial arts is a whole different thing than the study of fight sports. And they're both totally different from a close quarters combat system.
Yeah, I felt that the most, I think, when I started training jujitsu. I did jujitsu for about 2 years, pretty full time. And the school that I trained with was amazing, amazing professors, really good team, and strong lineage. But they also were very sport heavy and competition heavy. And I had no interest in competing. I'm in my late 30s. I'm not trying to get armbarred by, a 20-year-old. So it was not something I was into, and I realized very quickly, like, it's not a critique of what they're doing here. I loved it, but it was not what I was looking to study, and so it was the first time where I really saw the difference between that the martial arts training I had done prior. Before jujitsu, I had done Northern Shaolin for 2 years, and I was like, wow, this is a whole different approach, and they made it very clear that they were training for competition, and so I appreciated that. But I think people need to have all that in context when they're thinking about what they want to study, what they want to practice, and what they want to put their energy behind. I wanted to move on really quickly though. I know
One
it's
thing I wanted
hard.
to
Oh yeah, go ahead, go
one
ahead, go
thing
ahead.
one thing I wanted to point out though is that people forget, the difference between fight sports and close quarters combat and whatnot is illustrated pretty plainly in the very first scene of Enter the Dragon. We've all seen Enter the Dragon when Bruce Lee fights a young Sammo Hung.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a scene in there where Sammo Hung puts him in the perfect Ronda Rousey type armbar.
Mm.
Perfectly. Bruce Lee sinks his teeth in his Achilles tendon and he immediately lets go. There's an awful lot of sport jujitsu, sport BJJ tends to sometimes get pushed as the ultimate self defense or the ultimate close quarters combat. And it's just not because so much of
Right.
it can be stopped with stuff like biting, eye gouging, throat ripping, um, small digit manipulation. As much as the mixed martial arts has always said they have this rule and that rule and whatnot, they never mentioned small digit manipulation, especially
Mm-hmm.
before they wore the gloves. But if you do combat Japanese jiu-jitsu, one of the first things you'll learn is to grab the little finger and bend it back and break it. And you never saw anybody do that in the mixed martial art ever from the time it started in 1993. And it's a standard thing for somebody grabbing you.
Well, that
You
was
know,
my
it's a
when I first started training jujitsu. My professors had to keep stopping me from grabbing fingers, and I'm like, "Oh, but this is such an easy thing to pry their hand off of me."
yes,
No, you can't do
yes.
that. You can't do that.
That's what you learned in Japanese
Yeah,
combat jiu-jitsu even.
yeah.
It's take the little finger, it's the smallest one, you can always peel it off and break it instantly.
Yeah.
And you've never seen anybody do that in MMA in the whole time.
Right.
Fight sports are different than close quarters combat, and they're all different than classical martial arts, which what makes it the art
Mm.
is because you're learning the physical, you're learning the history, you're learning the philosophy, you're learning the health, you're adding the meditation, you're putting it all together and makes it art.
Mm. And for those who are listening, Frank and I also are lovers of MMA, and so we'll definitely do some shows on that stuff too. So it's
Oh
just
yeah, I love fight sports.
yeah, it's just understanding the different contexts of this all. So on the back to Bagua though, I know it's hard because we're doing an audio podcast. You know, some people are watching it on YouTube, but mostly people are going to be hearing this audio. Can you describe what Bagua is, how it works, compared to some other systems? Because it was notably, and I mean, still, it's so notable how different my body has to move with Bagua positions, rotations, spiraling movements. Can you try to, you know, via word, try to give people a little bit of a visual of what Bagua looks like?
Well, the whole thing with Bagua, it is continuous coiling, twisting, spiraling, circling, movement. For starters, Bagua never ever stands still. You are constantly in motion. You are, if possible, you're trying to circle into the person. You're trying to take the angle and then coil through them. Everything is done with a coil and a twist, every bit of it. And also, there's certain things you got to be careful about Bagua that are misconceptions too. Like you walk in a circle for training. You walk in a circle because it goes back to the old art that the martial art was adapted off from the study of the I Ching, because I Ching is a study of the phenomenon of change, a simple way to make change. Walk in a circle, turn around, change, go the other direction.
Mm,
But as a martial art, you would never do a 360 circle on a person. Never. There's no reason to. You do 45 degrees, 90 degrees, or maybe 180 degrees, but that's the furthest you would ever go because there's no reason to go past that. But you're doing that circling movement and you're constantly coiling. Your body is constantly twisted to give it this tension of the untwist so you can twist and untwist and twist
mm.
and untwist. It's a total circular, various types of various circles continuously. And
Do
like
you have
and you never stand still.
Do you have when I first started doing Bagua, I had a hard concept understanding coiling. Um just I just couldn't picture what it was. Do you have like some examples of coiling and natural phenomenon that might be good correlations for people?
Well, anytime your arm turns like this, you're coiling.
So internal, external
You know, and it's
rotation.
say from palm down to palm up, it's coiling.
Mm,
Fingers in to fingers out, it's coiling. Except you can take it through the entire body. And that's the whole thing is the whole body's supposed to be coiling.
mm.
One of the weird parts people have trouble with is the belly muscles are supposed to be coiling a lot. And that
For
drives
those who
it
don't see the
from
video,
there
Frank is dancing for us
open.
now.
But it coils. And the whole thing is the coil will move all the way from there up through the body and down through the legs.
And what's the power of the coil or the significance of the coil?
Well, things you can draw things into you, you can bounce things off of you from the coil.
Yeah. Yeah, so when someone thinks about Bagua training, what can they expect to be some of the foundational stuff that they're doing?
Well, the foundation, the same way that we're discussing before in the first week, that standing as a foundation, Bago replaces that with walking.
Mm,
And you do this specific mud tread stepping, and you practice the opening and closing of the body while you do it, and you walk in a circle. And you should be doing circle walking training in Bagua the same way you would do standing in anything else. So you can plan on walking around in a circle a lot. They claim when Yin Fu taught the young emperor, the Empress Dowager's son, the first thing he made him do for months was there was an arhat tree in the garden, and he made him circle around it 300 times a day.
Mm.
So one of the keys is circling, and then learning to coil. And pretty quickly you start getting into the movements because they all fit together with the basics.
Right, like in Northern Shaolin, we did a lot of horse stance. Tons of horse stance, always in horse stance. So this rotational walking is kind of like the equivalent of that.
Yes,
Yeah.
it replaces, in Shaolin you do horse stance. In a lot of internals you do shoulder width,
Hmm.
standing post stance. And Bagua replaces most of that. There's a little bit of standing, but it replaces most of that with circle walking.
And then, so like you were saying, it's not all spiraling movements per se. There are adaptations of linear kind of movements. I know you've told me about before. Can you talk a little bit about those adaptations in the Bagua system?
Well, linears sort of not necessarily how to explain it, but what I'm saying is not all circling. You go straight into a person, but you're still usually coiling in some extent while you're going straight into them. So there's very little dead straight movement. There's a couple of them. I mean, it's going to come up, but you're trying to get everything to coil within that up to middle movements. What
Trying to
it's
get
saying is
some angles, yeah.
not everything circles. A lot of it will use small angles.
Yeah. And then in terms of the kicking in the system, is there a lot of kicking in the system, or is it limited kicking?
There is kicking. There's a lot of low kicking. There's leg traps. There's leg trapping along with the low kicking. And then occasionally there are relatively high kicks that, go above the knee, groin, solar plexus, throat. But like any higher kick, they have to be set up. A high kick that isn't distracted first is never going to land.
Mm. And then is there any grappling or joint manipulation in the system?
Absolutely. Remember that one of the masters of the style and the founder of our style was a Shuaijiao wrestling champion. So, yes, there's quite a bit of grappling. And also, people forget when they teach China these days, they teach it like it's Chinese jiu-jitsu. But China was locking and ripping. And a lot of people don't teach the ripping. And there's all of that in Bagua also, is the locking and ripping techniques of China. And the whole thing is China getting separated from martial art as a separate martial art is a relatively new development. It's definitely a 1900s development. What it was all martial arts, the same way all martial arts had punching, kicking, knees, and elbows. They all had China, which was locking, holding, ripping.
Mm.
And it was just a part of every martial art. And then somebody decided Japanese jiu-jitsu was getting over. Why not separate the jiu-jitsu-like parts of kung fu and teach them as something separate?
Mm.
But almost every decent Chinese martial art has a China component, including Bak.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about with Bagua, I mean, we could keep going for a while on this, but just to wrap it up, you've talked about before how a lot of Chinese martial arts have brought some kind of meditation or energetic kind of training into their system, but that Bagua actually had that at its founding. And in fact, it sounds like it was from these tales. It was more of a meditative healing practice that was then adapted to fighting, a fighting system.
Yes.
Can you speak to
Well,
that?
not necessarily healing per se,
Mm.
but yes, as far as I know, the only martial art that has a meditative, high energetic, philosophical component that wasn't grafted onto the fighting art. Usually, you have a fighting art, somebody takes some meditation and grafts it into the training to remove fear and resulting hesitation from their martial art. And then from there, it may snowball into some pretty heavy meditation stuff, but it's all meditation and energy work grafted into the fighting system. Whereas Dong Hai Chuan obviously learned the basics of a system which I said is a study of the phenomenon of change, or a study of the I Ching, which is done physically and energetically as well as intellectually. And the physical and energetic parts of it happen to be really, really good health exercises along the way. And he learned it as that and adapted it into a fighting system for his own usage. And it's interesting, there are a number of schools out there, especially in the South, that claim to predate Dong Hai Chuan and claim that they had a fighting Bagua system before Dong Hai Chuan. And I must say that I'd have to agree with Professor Congo Wu, is pretty much the number one martial arts scholar in China. He's the guy for the government that sets up all the college courses, sets up all the tournaments, does all the research. And his personal martial art is Ba Gua Zhang. He's a disciple of Shaguo Zhen, who is the main disciple of Zhenrong Zhao.
Mm.
And for his master's degree, his master's thesis was the history of Bagua. And he traveled all over the country, finding everybody he could, studying everything he could, getting in as much depth as possible, and came up to the conclusion that there was no martial arts Bagua before Dong Hai Chuan. That Dong Hai Chuan created the martial art of Bagua. What he said he thinks happened in some cases was, as we know, Dong Hai Chuan had 72 students.
Mm.
And pretty much Chen Tinghua and Yin Fu get all the credit. And he
Right.
thinks that some of the schools of the other disciples, after going a generation or two, are getting absolutely no credit. And people going, that isn't Bagua because it wasn't Chung style or Yin style. Said, screw it. We don't need this Dong Hai Chuan thing. And started creating their own lineages that bypassed Dong Hai Chuan because they were upset of the big two getting all the credit as the only Bagua that there was. And that was his personal theory as to where these other systems that claimed that they had fighting Bagua before Dong Hai Chuan came from.
Yeah, anyone who
But
knows
no
anything
matter,
about martial arts history knows that that is a very common occurrence.
but
This revision of lineage.
yeah, Bagua is, as far as I know, the only martial art that started out as a high level monk's energy meditative type art and adapted into a fighting art. Or as I'm fond of saying, I'm sure from the view of a Taoist abbot, a Taoist monk, a Taoist hermit, that this working class guy learned their system and devolved it into a way to kick ass. Um, but no
Sounds
matter
about right.
what, I think it's the only one that started and then was adapted into a fighting art after already being a fully developed, energetic, meditative, philosophical art.
Mm. Well, and definitely, I mean, we just scratched the surface this episode, but if people want to know more about this history and understand more about the art of Ba Gua Zhang, definitely we'll put the link to the book that was authored by Frank and Tina, The Whirling Circles of Ba Gua Zhang. There it goes. So yeah, so and I got my copy too. Boom. It's all over the presses. So yeah, so we'll link to that for sure if people want to get deeper into this history. But Frank, thanks so much for picking at it today. And then next episode, we're gonna be continuing this conversation of the three core internal martial arts. We're gonna be talking about Tai Chi Chuan on episode 3. So definitely tune in next week. We'll dig deep into that, and I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of people who are mad at that episode, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, yeah. My concept of the foundations of Tai Chi Chuan is seen by the Beijing people as not real popular with some of the other people.
Yep, that's how it is. All right, Frank. Well, thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.
Cool. Take care.
Take care.